President-elect Trump with some key cabinet-level posts for his administration. In an unofficial announcement, he's tapping retired Marine General James Mattis for Secretary of Defense.
I don't want to tell you this because I want to save the suspense for next week. We are going to appoint Mad Dog Mattis as our Secretary of Defense.
The general has more than 40 years of military experience. He led U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan, earning him the nickname Mad Dog Mattis. The general is also the former head of the U.S. Central Command. Billionaire investor Wilbur Ross tapped for Commerce Secretary. Ross is known for buying distressed and failing companies and turning them around.
And making medical decisions.
Republican Congressman Tom Price of Georgia selected for Health and Human Services Secretary. He is the chair of the House Budget Committee and a former orthopedic surgeon who is critical of Obamacare. So far, Trump has selected 3 women for key positions.
We are so excited.
Former U.S. Secretary of Labor Elaine Chao, now as U.S. Transportation Secretary.
I love South Carolina.
South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. School choice activist Betsy DeVos for Education Secretary. DeVos has been an advocate for charter schools and school voucher programs.
The emergence of foreign militaries.
Retired 3-star General Mike Flynn for National Security Advisor. He has helped destroy extremist networks in Afghanistan and Iraq and is known as a skilled intelligence officer, even though he was forced out as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, reportedly over his combative management style.
Do you know how many security requests there were?
Kansas Representative Mike Pompeo tapped to be the next CIA director. Elected to Congress in 2010, Pompeo was a Tea Party favorite and one of the lead Republicans investigating the 2012 Benghazi attack. Then there's Steve Bannon, Trump's chief strategist. He spent 7 years in the U.S. Navy, was an investment banker for Goldman Sachs, and a Hollywood investor. Most recently, he made it his mission to take down the Republican Party establishment.
Come here, Jeff.
Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions is nominated for U.S. Attorney General. The former prosecutor has opposed immigration reform as well as bipartisan proposals to cut mandatory minimum prison sentences. Sessions has been accused of calling civil rights groups un-American and criticizing the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you.
And finally, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, Reince Priebus, who will be the president-elect's chief of staff. While he's a mainstream pick that many Republicans find encouraging,
My God.
some Tea Party leaders fear Priebus is too much of a Washington insider.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next president of the United States, Donald Trump. Thank you. It's been an honor. God bless. Thank God.
And this morning in politics, Donald Trump defending his decision to accept a phone call from the president of Taiwan. That's something that no U.S. president or president-elect has done in nearly 4 decades. This controversy, it's all brewing as the Trump team continues crisscrossing the country in what's being billed a thank you tour. ABC's David Wright is at Trump Tower for us this morning with the very latest on the transition. Hi, David.
Hi, Paula. Beijing this morning said it has lodged solemn representations to the U.S. over that call. And Trump is now the first U.S. leader to speak with the Taiwanese president since Jimmy Carter. It has the makings of a diplomatic incident, and it's impossible to say right now whether this was a rookie mistake or a deliberate provocation.
China is ripping us off. You know who's getting the oil? China.
What China's doing to us is horrible.
On the campaign trail, Donald Trump made a habit of promising to be a thorn in China's side.
They are the greatest currency manipulators ever.
And now Trump is keeping that promise with a simple phone call. By accepting a congratulatory call from Taiwan's president, President-elect Trump broke 4 decades of U.S. diplomatic tradition. Ever since Nixon's visit to China in 1972, the U.S. has had a one-China policy, recognizing only one of the 2 countries that call themselves China. Overnight, he tweeted defensively that Taiwan's president called me Top aides won't say if the fact that he took the call signals a change in U.S. policy.
He's well aware of what U.S. policy has been.
Trump has yet to announce a Secretary of State, the top diplomat whose job it would be to smooth over any bad feelings in Beijing. One of 7 cabinet seats yet to be filled. And Trump is now taking flack from a possible pick for VA Secretary Sarah Palin over the deal he struck with Carrier. Palin, an early endorser of Trump's, is going rogue in this op-ed, blasting the Carrier deal as crony capitalism and a hallmark of corruption and socialism. Now, Trump isn't showing any signs of changing his approach to job displacement, tweeting overnight about another Indiana company that's taking its jobs to Mexico, naming and shaming them. The company is called Rexner. Dan?
Can't remember a presidential transition that was this eventful. David Wright, thank you very much for your reporting this morning. Let's talk more about all of this now with ABC News political analyst Matthew Dowd. Let's start. Good morning, by the way.
Good morning.
Let's start with this thing in Taiwan. Many foreign policy experts are aghast that the president-elect did this. Some people, however, are applauding him. So, in your view, is Trump crazy or crazy like a fox?
Probably a little bit of both would be the definition of this. I was thinking about what sort of typifies this, and I thought of the movie Rush Hour. His supporters and his staff are acting like he's Jackie Chan, knows exactly what he's doing in all this. Everybody else thinks he's Chris Tucker, stumbling through this and maybe finds a success in the middle of this. I think it's problematic for 2 reasons.
I hope our viewers have seen Rush Hour, by the way.
For 3 of them. There's 3 Rush Hours, so you better have saw one. To me, it's problematic for 2 reasons. One is if he did this unintentionally, obviously that's a big rookie mistake, and he needs to figure that out if he didn't understand what our policy has been towards China. But 2, if he did this intentionally, but he did it without a Far East policy in place to explain what the context of this, and a staff in place that actually could explain to the public why you were doing this, what's the outcome of this, and what's the real strategy of this. My guess is this was Donald Trump doing something viscerally, took a call from a leader, and now is trying to figure out how, in the aftermath of that, to explain it.
So some of the other phone calls he's had with foreign leaders have raised some eyebrows. Just a couple of examples here. He praised the president of Kazakhstan, even though that president is really a dictator. He invited the president of the Philippines to Washington, even though there's been a lot of howling about massive human rights abuses in Philippines in the last year or so. So what do you think overall is going on here? And could it be good that he's just shaking things up?
Well, I think, one, his supporters think it's really good. Getting in a fight with China, I think, is a good thing for most of his supporters in this. I think it does demonstrate he probably needs to get a Secretary of State nominee on the board pretty quickly. But one thing we learned in the campaign, and that we're now learning him as president, he didn't play by the rules in the campaign. He's not going to play by the rules of diplomacy and international relations. He's just not going to do it.
Very quickly before we run here, Sarah Palin, did she just cost herself a cabinet post?
My guess is that was already decided before, and then she released the statement. But one thing, I think she's right, actually. This is a case of rewarding a specific company with it. So in this case, from conservative Republican policy, she's right. It's anathema to them that Donald Trump did this.
Matt Dowd, thank you. Appreciate it. And the people from Rush Hour, thank you as well. A quick programming note here. ABC News chief anchor George Stephanopoulos is going to go one-on-one with the Vice President-elect Mike Pence tomorrow morning on This Week right here on ABC. Thanks again, Matt.
Thanks.
Controversy over the call that Mr. Trump took this week from Taiwan's President Tsai, the first time leaders of our 2 countries have, to the best of our knowledge, spoken since the U.S. broke off relations in 1979. Now, you say that Mr. Trump was fully briefed, knew what he was doing before this call, which raises the question, does he intend to change our one China policy, which recognizes only Beijing?
Well, President-elect Trump is well aware of our one China policy. He accepted a congratulatory call from the president of Taiwan. That marks probably the 48th or 50th world leader that has reached out to the president-elect or the vice president-elect Mike Pence since they won the election last month, Chris. They've talked to the prime ministers or presidents of Israel, of Singapore, of Japan, of China.
But this one's different. So the question, I guess, is, does this signal a change in policy, or was it just a phone call?
It was just a phone call at this point. It signals the fact that he accepted a congratulatory call. I know that China has a perspective on it. I know the White House and State Department probably have a perspective on it, and certainly Taiwan has a perspective on it. But the president-elect's perspective is that he accepted a congratulatory call, and when he's sworn in as president and commander-in-chief in a little over a month, Chris, he will make clear what the fullness of his plans are. But people shouldn't read too much into it. And some of the press coverage, not here necessarily, but elsewhere, is really astonishing when you think about how it was covered when Barack Obama was going to try to reach out to Iran and come up with an Iran nuclear deal. And this man the president-elect received a phone call from a world leader in another country. We know about One China. He knows about One China. He's routinely briefed on these matters, and that's just what it is.
So let me ask you about this. And I think one of the reasons such a big deal was made of it is because of the fact that the president-elect has had a number of controversial phone calls with foreign leaders. He reportedly told Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif he would, quote, play any role you want me to play to address and find solutions to the country's problems, despite Pakistan's relationship with terrorists. He also spoke with Philippine President Duterte, who's been accused of ordering the murder of thousands of suspected drug dealers, which raises the question, Kellyanne, why is Mr. Trump refusing the State Department's offer to brief him before these calls, and why is he skipping the daily briefings, intelligence briefings that President Obama gets every day?
He is not always skipping those briefings, and he's briefed by any number of credible sources on these issues. And I think people, Chris, frankly, are cherry picking about these world leaders and then they're accusing the president-elect of somehow countenancing some of these behaviors in these other places. But look, that's really unfair when you think about, we just had an election and the opponent, Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, was using the State Department to get money from foreign governments like Saudi Arabia, which doesn't even respect girls and women. So I think people just have their hair on fire, particularly those who believe we're still entrenched in the permanent campaign, are trying to reverse the election results from last week. Let's give this man time to form his cabinet. And he's also showing respect to the current president, President Obama, who still is the president for about 6.5 more weeks, and the commander-in-chief certainly. He's not out there, but President-elect Trump is not out there making policy or announcing new policy prescriptions worldwide. He's merely taking phone calls, and he will, I'm sure, re-engage with many of these leaders once he takes the oath of office.
Kellyanne, speaking of people with hair on fire, last week you went on several of the other Sunday talk shows to express the concern of Trump supporters about the consideration of Mitt Romney as Secretary of State. Here's a clip.
I'm hearing from people who say, hey, my...
You say Mr. Trump gave you permission, but there's a bigger question, which is that a proper way to treat somebody who is talking about accepting a role in public service?
Well, first, the president-elect has said he gave me permission. He's quoted in the New York Times and elsewhere saying that, and that's actually true. I would not say something publicly that I hadn't expressed privately, and I would never purposely embarrass him. He has my respect and my duty, frankly, my service. So
I'm not talking about Mr. Trump. I'm talking about Mr. Romney. Is that an appropriate way to treat a guy who is just discussing public service to say people are going to feel betrayed?
Well, first of all, I'm reflecting the news, not trying to make the news. I was astonished, Chris, that in a week when President-elect Trump told the New York Times on the record he would relook at waterboarding, he would relook at the Paris Accords on climate change, he was not particularly interested in focusing on prosecuting Hillary Clinton any further because he was focused on healthcare and immigration. He understands that other agencies and individuals are charged with that responsibility. But in a week when he said that, the breathtaking backlash was really about this particular prospective cabinet member. I would turn the question around and ask, was it appropriate for Governor Romney to stick his neck out so far in attacking Donald Trump and never walking it back and never encouraging people to support the nominee once Mr. Trump had won the nomination squarely and fairly. So I've spoken my piece on that, and certainly the president-elect knows, and I've said publicly, and I will say here again, whatever he chooses and whomever he chooses has my full support and backing.
Yeah, but let me just...
and he knows that.
Let me just quickly follow up on that. Clearly, Romney is under consideration. We just showed a picture of them having dinner on Tuesday night. If Mr. Trump picks Romney, what are you going to say to those Trump supporters who are going to feel betrayed?
I'm going to say to those Trump supporters what I say to those who did not vote for the new president-elect, Chris, some of whom seem to have a hard time accepting the fact that he is their president. I'm going to say then you have to work together. You have to accept his judgment. The man is brilliant. The man is the best negotiator. He's the best connector and communicator, obviously. He just pulled off the upset of a century, perhaps. And the fact is that you have to trust his instincts and his judgment, because it's what brought so many people along to his movement in the first place, and it certainly is what inspires me daily to work with him. So everyone, I hope, will accept that, and the president-elect and the president-elect alone will make the decision as to whom he should have serving him at the highest levels of government.
Let's talk about Mr. Trump's instincts, because he went to Indiana this week to celebrate, after his intervention, the fact that Carrier is going to keep 1,000 jobs in the state. Here he is.
Listen, companies are not going to leave the United States anymore.
But in an editorial Friday with the headline, "Trump's Carrier Shakedown," the Wall Street Journal said America won't become more prosperous by forcing companies to make non-economic investments. A nation gets rich when individuals and business are allowed to take risks as they see fit in a competitive economy. Kellyanne, I don't have to tell you, that's the conservative view of how a free market works, and that politicians shouldn't be picking winners and losers. Sarah Palin calls this an example of crony capitalism.
Well, the president-elect just simply disagrees. And if you look at what happened, this is what leaders do. Certainly what people who have been wildly successful in building businesses across the globe, as the president-elect has been. You produce, you deliver, you achieve results. And everybody looks at the result here, which is about 1,100 workers are going to stay in Indiana. His running mate, the vice president-elect, is the governor of Indiana. And I think together they worked with Carrier. And, you know, everybody's looking at it as a stick. There are carrots. There are incentives here. They worked with Carrier to find a way together to keep those jobs here and not to go to Mexico. It's astonishing to see this happen. The current president could have done it. He never did it. The president elected it even before he was sworn in. And let me just say, those $7 million in incentives, they carry over 10 years. So about $700,000 per year in incentives, Chris, as part of this deal. That's about $785, maybe $800 per worker. So people have to put this in perspective before they act like it's some type of big-footed interventionist. This guy ran from day one on bringing back manufacturing jobs from China, Mexico, and elsewhere, and he's already delivered.
I want to get into two more subjects with you. One, Harvard's Institute of Politics holds a forum every 4 years where representatives of the winning and losing campaigns get together and try to have a kind of academic review of what happened and why one side won, one side lost. Well, it wasn't that way this year. It got pretty ugly, and here are some of the exchanges between you and Clinton Communications Director Jennifer Palmieri. Here they are.
Do you think...
What did you take away from that?
Well, the rest of the exchange was me telling her and her team, as politely as I could, that you missed America. All you needed to do was recognize that a lot of voters had a very hard time accepting Hillary Clinton as this outsider disruptor who was ethically clean and would treat all Americans fairly, had to run an aspirational, uplifting campaign that had an economic message for a lot of working America. The idea that, oh, you know what, they can say what they want about me and my team. We've got very broad shoulders over here, as you can imagine. But to besmirch over 60 million hardworking men and women in this country who became part of the Trump movement, to pretend that Donald Trump was not out there every single day, Chris, sometimes 4, 5, 7 stops in a single day, bringing his case directly to the American people and saying what to them? That we're going to reform the Veterans Administration, which leaves veterans to die, that we're going to stand behind law enforcement and the thin blue line, that he's going to create 25 million jobs over 10 years, unleash energy investment, have an infrastructure program, repeal and replace Obamacare, which has really reduced the quality and the choice and the access and increased the price of health care for many Americans, left others behind, that he's going to defeat radical Islamic terrorism in the face of Hillary Clinton referring to them as our determined enemies, and President Obama saying that they're the JV team that's been brushed back. Nobody believes that. Yep. And so to besmirch those voters is really beyond the pale to me. Now, I had already, that was a 2.5-hour forum, and you're playing a couple clips, so I had already credited them as brilliant strategists, as people I respect as professionals. That was all done. But there was no grace, there was no congratulations from them, and frankly, there's no self-awareness that they lost the election because they missed America. They blame Bernie Sanders. They blame Jim Comey. It's typical of Hillary Clinton. In Hillary Clinton's world, it's always somebody else's fault.
All right, one last thing. I'm glad to see that this was such an academic discussion. Finally, we're going to, in a couple of moments, have Jill Stein on the program, the Green Party presidential nominee, who is pushing recounts in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. What do you say to her about those efforts?
I'd say to her, give it up, as it seems like you're doing in Pennsylvania, for a very simple reason. Even your friends in the Clinton campaign have admitted that these recounts will not change any result. Hillary Clinton gained a whopping 1 vote, Chris, 1. And so I read one article, the Daily Caller, I believe, that said it, at this pace, Hillary Clinton could change the election results in Wisconsin in 74.5 years. I don't think America's going to sit around and wait for that to happen. The people have spoken. I was asked on this program and many others that will you accept the election results? So the question for Jill Stein and Hillary Clinton and those who just are still in the grief, anger, and denial stages, will you start moving over to acceptance and let this president-elect and vice president-elect get on with the business of government, have a peaceful transfer of power? The other thing is, I'm just astonished how Jill Stein is now the favorite flavor of the left. They ignored her and ridiculed her, and a lot of their friends in the media made sure she had no coverage and no oxygen.
I got to cut you off so I can get her on the show.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Wish her well for me, but yeah, I mean, gracious. Yeah, it's good to be gracious and to admit what you see in front of you. In this case, Donald Trump won 306 electoral votes, 30 of 50 states, 2,600 counties.
Okay.
It wasn't even close.